There is a particular kind of humiliation that doesn't announce itself with screaming or shattered glass. It arrives quietly, in a stolen glance, in the curve of someone else's spine pressed against the man who was supposed to be yours, in the way the moonlight catches something you were never meant to see. Seraphina Vale had survived 5 years of whispered doubts, 5 years of telling herself that patience was its own form of dignity. She would discover, on the night of the royal masquerade, that she had confused endurance with love, and that the most dangerous man in the kingdom had been watching her figure out the difference all along. Stay, because what happens next will rearrange everything you think you know about who gets chosen and why.
Odyssey.
The masquerade had been Lady Seraphina Vale's idea of controlled beauty. She had spent 3 weeks selecting her gown, ivory silk overlaid with silver thread that caught the candlelight like something not entirely of this world, and another 2 arranging the pearl and obsidian mask that framed her eyes without concealing the intelligence behind them. She had not dressed to be noticed. She had dressed to belong, which was a different ambition entirely, and one she had been quietly pursuing since the age of 17, when her father's name had been dragged through court mud, and she had learned that belonging was the only armor the aristocracy respected. The Callaway Palace's Eastern Ballroom was exactly the kind of spectacle that made lesser nobles weep with gratitude and sharper ones calculate. Crystal chandeliers, 300 candles, musicians imported from the southern provinces playing something between a waltz and a hymn. The court's finest families circling one another in gorgeous predatory loops, their masks doing nothing to hide the hunger in their eyes, because hunger, Seraphina had long understood, was the one thing the aristocracy never bothered concealing. She moved through it all with practiced grace, accepting a glass of champagne she did not intend to drink, exchanging pleasantries she did not intend to mean. She was good at this. 5 years of standing beside Crown Duke Adrian Blackthorn, not quite betrothed, not quite dismissed, occupying that particular purgatory the court called favored, had made her extraordinarily good at performing ease while calculating distance. Adrian was across the room. She could find him without looking, the way a plant turns toward light it cannot name, a reflex so deep it had stopped feeling like a choice years ago. He was speaking with Lord Harrington, his silver mask pushed up on his forehead, with the careless authority of a man who had forgotten he was supposed to be disguised. His profile was clean and perfect and familiar in the way of something you have memorized so thoroughly it no longer surprises you, which Seraphina had once mistaken for intimacy. She watched him for exactly 4 seconds. Then she looked away. The night was warm for autumn, and she had been standing in the same polished corner of the ballroom for 40 minutes, which was precisely 30 minutes longer than she could sustain the performance without needing air that didn't taste like other people's ambition. She set her untouched champagne on the tray of a passing servant and moved toward the eastern terrace doors. The gardens at night were a different kingdom. Callaway's grounds transformed after dark. The geometric hedgerows became walls. The fountain paths became corridors. The decorative lanterns strung between the trees became a constellation that existed only here, only now. Seraphina breathed in slowly. The music from the ballroom filtered through the stone walls, muted and civilized, and for a moment she allowed herself to exist outside the performance entirely. She walked without particular direction, following the gravel path past the ornamental roses, past the reflecting pool where her ivory gown scattered into silver fragments across the water's surface. She had done this before, stolen 10 minutes of solitude at royal events, and had developed a precise internal map of when she could disappear without the absence being noted. The garden pavilion at the eastern edge of the grounds was not on her intended route, but she saw the light from 30 feet away, a soft amber glow from within the latticed structure, the kind of private illumination that suggested someone had carried a lantern inside for reasons that had nothing to do with enjoying the garden architecture. And something in her chest shifted its weight in a way she could not name. Later, she would decide that she had known. Not in any way she could articulate, not in the specific damning particulars, but something in her body had recognized what her mind was still protecting her from, because she had been protecting herself from it for a very long time. She stopped 6 feet from the pavilion's entrance. The lattice panels were decorative, not opaque. The amber light fell through them in warm geometric patterns. She could hear something, a soft sound, intimate and low, the kind of sound that has no business being made in a garden that belongs to a royal masquerade. And she stood completely still, The way prey animals freeze not from cowardice, but from the terrible mammalian understanding that some knowledge, once confirmed, cannot be undone. Adrian's voice. She recognized it immediately because 5 years had worn it into her like a groove in stone. But it was softer than she had ever heard it in her presence, softer and more unguarded, carrying something she had spent 5 years trying to locate and failing, and the recognition of that particular softness was somehow more devastating than the sight itself. She looked anyway. She would never entirely forgive herself for that. Not because looking was wrong, but because she had told herself over and over that she was a woman who did not need confirmation, that her dignity did not require proof, that she was above the specific humiliation of witnessing. She looked anyway. Adrian's silver masquerade jacket was unmistakable. His hands were in someone else's hair, dark hair, loose now from its formal arrangement, cascading over fingers that Seraphina had spent years watching navigate court documents and sword hilts and wine glasses, but never, not once, this careless intimacy. Lady Celeste Arden's face was turned upward, her mask discarded on the pavilion bench, her expression carrying that particular species of satisfaction that required no narration. Seraphina took exactly one step backward. The gravel whispered under her heel, like a small betrayal. She turned and walked away. She did not run. She had the dim, furious awareness that her body was performing composure the way a clockwork mechanism performs its function. Not from choice, not from feeling, but from the fact that the mechanism had been so thoroughly wound that it simply continued operating regardless of what surrounded it. Her spine was straight. Her pace was measured. The pearl and obsidian mask was still perfectly positioned over her eyes. She made it 40 feet before her vision began to fracture at the edges. It was not grief. She would sort through the labels later and decide that what she felt in those 40 feet was not grief, but rather the specific, annihilating sensation of a structure collapsing that you had been quietly holding up for years. Not grief, more like the muscular exhaustion of finally letting go. Her hands, when she glanced down at them, were trembling very slightly, the kind of trembling that has nothing to do with cold. She found a stone bench partially concealed by a topiary arrangement shaped into something that had once been a swan, and had become, through years of imprecise gardening, merely an ambitious shrub. She sat down on it with the precision of a woman who does not trust her legs and stared at the ground between her feet. The music from the ballroom continued its civilized progression. She pressed the heels of her hands against her cheekbones, under the lower edge of the mask, and breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The basic mechanics of continuing to exist, stripped of all ornamentation. You saw something that was going to hurt you, and you looked at it anyway. The voice came from her left. She didn't startle. In retrospect, she would find this detail both strange and illuminating, that in the worst moment of 5 years of increasingly careful living, her body's response to an unexpected male voice in a dark garden was not fear, but rather the flat, exhausted recognition that the night had apparently not finished with her yet. She turned her head. Duke Lucien Ravenscroft was standing at a distance of perhaps 8 feet, partially in shadow, his black masquerade coat distinguishing him from the darkness primarily because it was a slightly different shade of it. His mask, dark leather, minimal, the kind that covered the upper half of the face without pretending to be anything other than what it was, had been removed and was held loosely in his left hand. His face in the ambient garden light was precisely what the court said it was. The sharp angles of a man built more for function than for admiration, with eyes that assessed the way a physician assesses rather than the way a courtier assesses, which is to say clinically, and without the softening lens of what they hope to find. Seraphina Vale had spoken to Lucien Ravenscroft on 3 occasions in 5 years. All 3 had been at political events. All 3 had been brief, formal, and watched by everyone in the room. "That's an intrusive observation," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved. "Yes," he said. He didn't apologize. "Do you want me to leave?" She considered the question with the same care she had given every decision of the last 5 years, which was excessive for a garden encounter and appropriate for everything else. The truth was that she did not particularly want him to leave. The truth was that she was sitting on a stone bench in the dark, crying very quietly behind a pearl mask, and the only thing worse than company right now was the particular flavor of solitude that followed public humiliation. "I want," she said carefully, "for the last 10 minutes not to have happened." "That's not available." He said it without cruelty. Factually, The way you say the sun has set when the darkness is already established. Then no, she said, you don't have to leave. He sat down on the bench, leaving approximately 3 feet of distance between them, with the particular body language of a man who had spent years deploying his physical presence as an instrument of intimidation and had made a conscious, deliberate decision to fold that instrument away. Seraphina noted this without being able to explain how she noted it. She was good at reading the difference between men who reduced their threat display because they wanted something and men who reduced it because the situation required a different tool. With Lucien Ravenscroft, she found, unusually, that she could not immediately tell which category applied. They sat in silence for a moment. How long have you known? He asked. Tonight, she said. Then, I think I've known longer than tonight. I think I've been collecting the evidence for years and refusing to submit it to myself. That's a significant amount of work, he said. Sustained self-deception at that level requires almost as much intelligence as its opposite. She looked at him sideways. Is that meant to be a compliment? It's meant to be accurate. She removed her mask. It felt, in the moment, like the last pretense the evening was willing to allow her, and she was tired of the weight of it on her face. She folded it in her lap and stared at it, the pearl beading and the obsidian detailing and the 3 weeks of careful selection it represented, and thought that she had spent extraordinary amounts of time on the surface of things, on the crafted presentation of herself as a woman whose instincts were perfect and whose choices were deliberate, and who did not require the validation of a man who was, at this precise moment, kissing someone else in a garden pavilion 40 feet away. He's been involved with Lady Celeste Arden for a while, Lucien said. Not as a question. I'm gathering that. The Arden family destroyed your father's trade agreements. 18 months of legal maneuvering that ended his involvement in northern commerce and cost him half his estate. I'm aware of my own history, Duke Ravenscroft. I know you are. His voice, she noticed, had a particular quality she had not expected, not the cold precision the court attributed to him, but something more considered, as though every sentence was assembled rather than performed. I'm noting the specific fact that the man you intended to marry has been conducting a private liaison with the daughter of your family's primary enemy, and that the nature of their arrangement has apparently been well established enough that he chose a royal masquerade to conduct it. That suggests, she said, with a steadiness that surprised her, either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary carelessness. With Adrian Blackthorn, it's generally both. She turned to look at him fully then. Lucien Ravenscroft met her gaze without adjustment, without the micro-shifts that most people made when caught looking directly at something they weren't entirely sure they were entitled to see. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided he is entitled to assess, which should have been offensive and was instead, inexplicably, the first honest interaction she'd had all evening. You and the Crown Duke despise each other, she said. We oppose each other on the Royal Council. That's distinct from personal feeling. The court doesn't see the distinction. The court also believes I eat my correspondence and frighten horses, he said. I don't weight their assessments particularly heavily, despite everything, despite the trembling in her hands and the specific weight settling in her chest, and the knowledge that she would be processing this night for years. She felt something shift in the region of her ribcage that was not grief and was not relief and was not quite anything she had a name for. It was more like the sensation of a key turning in a lock she had forgotten she was carrying. Why are you out here? She asked, instead of inside leveraging the social architecture of the masquerade. I was watching the room, he said. I saw you leave. I followed you. That's a remarkably direct answer. I find directness conserves significant time. Why did you follow me? I was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man deciding how much to reveal, she thought, but the silence of a man who was choosing the precise language for something he had already decided to say. There was a difference, and she was trained enough in court dynamics to identify it. Because, he said, I have been watching you navigate that room for 5 years, and I have been watching you be patient and careful and extraordinarily competent, and I have been watching you invest that competence into a man who did not deserve the investment. And tonight I watched you figure that out, and I thought that deserved, at minimum, the company of someone who is not going to offer you either false comfort or tactical pity. Seraphina stared at him. You've been watching me for 5 years, she said. Yes. That's unusual, I'm aware. She was quiet. The music from the ballroom shifted to something slower, more melancholy, the kind of music they brought out in the second half of the evening, when the champagne had done its work and the dancing had softened into something that required physical proximity. She could hear the faint percussion of it against the night air. "He's going to come back into that ballroom," she said. "In approximately 20 minutes, I estimate. He will return to that ballroom and look for me. And when he doesn't find me, he will be concerned. And when he finds me, he will perform concern very convincingly, and I will be expected to accept the performance." "Yes," Lucien said. "And if I don't accept it, if I show what I actually know and what I actually feel, then I become the difficult one, the unreasonable one, the woman who caused a scene at the royal masquerade." "Yes," he said again, "and Celeste Arden will be sympathetic, because she's the wronged party, in the court's narrative, the woman who fell for a man who was half committed to someone else. The court," Lucien said, "will construct whatever narrative requires the least structural change to its existing beliefs. Adrian Blackthorn is the Crown Duke. His choices come with institutional protection. That protection will be extended to the woman who keeps his confidence and retracted from the woman who doesn't." She heard it, the thing he wasn't saying. She heard it the way you hear a door opening in a dark house. Not the sound itself, but the implication of the air moving differently. "Say what you're actually saying," she told him. He looked at her. In the garden's ambient light, his eyes were very dark and very still, and carrying something that Seraphina would later spend considerable time trying to categorize and finally settle on as the look of a man who has been waiting. Not impatiently, not desperately, but with the specific quality of patience that belongs to people who have calculated odds and found them acceptable. "Marry me instead." The night insects continued their business. The muted music played on. Somewhere in the distance, a horse in the palace stables shifted its weight, and the sound traveled through the quiet with the clarity of a distant bell. Seraphina looked at him for a long time. "You're serious," she said. "I don't make proposals I'm not serious about. I've never made one before. You're proposing to a woman you found crying on a garden bench 20 minutes after she discovered her." She stopped. She hadn't called Adrian anything specific yet. The words available to her were all wrong. Not wrong in the sense of inaccurate, but wrong in the sense of reducing something complex to something simple. After she discovered the truth about her situation. "Yes, that's..." She searched for the word. "That's either the most callous thing I've heard this year or the most rational." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Lucien said. She stood up. The movement was abrupt, not agitated, but decisive. The movement of a woman who thinks better when she is not stationary. She walked 3 steps toward the reflecting pool, stopped, turned back. Lucien had not moved. He watched her with the same quality of stillness he'd had since he sat down. Not passive, not predatory, but present in a way that felt fundamentally unlike any presence she had experienced in 5 years of navigating the court. "What would you get out of it?" she asked. "An alliance with one of the kingdom's most respected families. Access to the Vale trade networks in the Western Territories. A duchess whose competence and reputation are both established." He paused. "And a marriage that Adrian Blackthorn will spend years resenting, which is a political advantage I would not pretend to find trivial. At least you're honest about it. Dishonesty requires effort I prefer to allocate elsewhere." "And what would I get?" she asked. The question came out sharper than she intended. Not bitter, but the particular sharpness of a woman who has stopped performing softness for the evening, beyond the obvious social rehabilitation of not being the woman who got left. Lucien was quiet for a moment. "You would get," he said, "a husband who will never humiliate you. I can promise you that without reservation or condition. Not because I am a gentleman. I'm not. Not because I don't have my own interests. I do. But because I have no interest in possessing a person and then dismantling them. That's not..." He stopped. Something moved across his face that was not quite an expression and was not quite its absence. Something that suggested he was navigating close to territory he didn't habitually expose. "That's not the arrangement I'm proposing." She stared at him. "No one will ever humiliate you again," he said. "Not in my house. Not under my name. Not while I am in a position to prevent it." The words were not romantic. They were delivered with the same measured weight he'd given everything else, the same quality of statement rather than performance. And it was precisely that quality, the absence of ornament, the refusal of the language of courtship, that landed in her chest with the force of something she had not known she was waiting to hear. She had been offered beautiful promises for 5 years. She had been offered the vocabulary of devotion, the gestures of preference, the elaborate architecture of implied commitment. None of it had ever felt like this, like being told something real at the cost of telling it plainly by a man who could have wrapped it in whatever presentation he chose and had instead chosen the unadorned version. I need, she said, to think. Of course, he said. You understand that this is an insane conversation. The best ones usually are. You're asking me to agree to a marriage on a garden bench at a masquerade within 20 minutes of having your world rearranged? Yes, he said. I'm aware of the timing. I'm not asking you to agree tonight. I'm asking you to consider it. Tonight, I'm asking you to know it's available. She looked at him across the small distance of the garden, in the amber light from 100 lanterns strung between the old trees, and tried to understand what she was actually seeing. Not the court's version, not the Iron Duke, not the political predator, not the coldest man in the royal council. She was looking at a man who had followed her into a dark garden and offered her something that had nothing to do with softness or sentiment, and everything to do with the specific form of respect that says, I see what you're worth, and I am willing to put the weight of my name behind that assessment. I'll consider it, she said. Something shifted in his face, barely, less than the movement of a single muscle, the kind of change that required knowing what to look for and years of practice in reading men who had learned to conceal themselves. But she caught it. She was by this point in her life extraordinarily good at catching things. Thank you, he said. They walked back toward the palace separately, at separate times, which was the minimum courtesy the situation required. Seraphina re-entered the ballroom from the terrace doors and stood for a moment at the threshold, her mask replaced, her composure reassembled with the thoroughness of a woman who has been doing this long enough that the reconstruction is nearly automatic. The ballroom looked the same as it had when she left. This struck her as briefly astonishing, that 300 people could go on executing the choreography of the court's social evening, while her entire understanding of the last 5 years had been quietly dismantled and left in pieces on a garden path. Time did that. Events of seismic personal significance occurred in the same three-dimensional space as the perfectly ordinary forward march of everyone else's evening, and the discrepancy between those scales was one of the more disorienting features of being human. She collected a new glass of champagne. She did not drink it. She found her position in the room with the automatic precision of a woman who has spent years calculating where to stand. She smiled at Lady Westmore, who was describing something about her daughter's debut. She exchanged 4 sentences with Lord Calloway's nephew about the provincial harvest reports, which she had read and he had not. And she kept Lucien Ravenscroft's proposal somewhere in the center of her chest, turning it over with the part of her mind she kept separate from the performance, examining its edges and its weight, thinking about what it meant that the most feared man in the kingdom had offered her the one thing she had never heard said plainly, not love. He hadn't offered love, and she was honest enough with herself on this particular night to recognize that she would not have believed love from a man she had known for 40 minutes on a garden bench. What he had offered was more foundational than love and more durable than its absence. He had offered the kind of scene that doesn't require you to be softened first. Adrian found her at the hour. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. She knew his gait, the measured confidence of it, the slight asymmetry from an old riding injury that had never quite corrected itself. She had time, between the hearing and the seeing, to assemble herself entirely. He materialized at her left elbow wearing his Crown Duke expression, the one she had catalogued and analyzed, and she now understood with the specific clarity of retroactive honesty, the one she had never quite cracked because she had been looking for softness in a face that stored its truth elsewhere. There you are, he said, light, easy, the tone of a man accounting for a brief, unremarkable absence. Here I am, she said. She looked at him, really looked, the way she had been avoiding looking all evening because looking directly at something requires acknowledging what you see. His jawline, his careful eyes. The silver jacket that had been, 25 minutes ago, the most recognizable thing about a scene she had not meant to witness. She felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, the 5 years in her body. Not grief, not anger, something more structural. The sensation of a building you've been living in revealing its actual foundations, which have never been what the facade suggested. The Harrington discussion went long, he said. Apologies. No need, she said. Something moved through his eyes. She caught it, the slight recalibration, the almost imperceptible shift of a man who has been expecting a particular version of a conversation and has encountered instead an absence of the expected material. She filed it. She had been filing Adrian's micro-reactions for years, and she was very good at it, and she understood precisely what that recalibration meant. He was looking for evidence of what she knew, and he was looking for it in her face, and he was not finding it. "Good," said something in her very quietly. "Let him look." "You look tired," he said. "It's been a long evening," she said. He reached out and touched her wrist, light, proprietary, the gesture of a man exercising a claim without examining whether the claim was current. She let him. She watched her own hand against the silk of her gown and thought about a garden 40 feet away and a man who had sat beside her on a bench and told her the truth before he asked her for anything. "I should make my rounds," she said. "Lady Calloway has been trying to catch my eye for the better part of an hour." "Of course." He released her wrist. "Save the last waltz." She looked at him. "Of course," she said. She walked away. She did not look back. But she was aware, with the precision she had developed over years of moving through rooms that were monitoring her, that Adrian's gaze followed her for approximately 15 seconds before the demands of his own performance reclaimed his attention. She did not look for Lucien Ravenscroft, but she was aware, with a different quality of precision, newer, less understood, that he was in the room and that he was not watching her the way the court watched her, which was as a variable in their own calculations. He was watching her the way a person watches something they have already decided matters. She made her rounds. She danced twice, once with Lord Harrington's son and once with a minor earl from the eastern provinces whose name she collected and filed. She smiled precisely as much as the situation required, and she said precisely as much as the situation required, and she held the entirety of the night's actual content in that separate center part of herself, untouched by the performance surrounding it. The last waltz was announced at midnight. She was standing near the terrace doors when she heard it, with Lady Westmore and 2 other women whose names she would remember in the morning when the evening was over and the machinery of her mind returned to full operation. Adrian was crossing the room toward her from the eastern end of the ballroom, navigating the assembled court with the ease of a man who knew himself to be its natural center. She watched him come, and she thought about 5 years. The way a person thinks about 5 years, not as a coherent narrative, but as a series of individual moments, the dinners and the councils and the careful conversations, and the time she had told herself she was reading patience as love when she was actually reading tolerance as preference. The individual moments of it, laid out in sequence, carrying the weight of time invested in something that had been, apparently, always carrying a different center of gravity than she had understood. She thought about a garden, a stone bench, a man who had told her the truth without being asked. Adrian reached her side and offered his hand. She looked at it. His hand, familiar, well-maintained, carrying the slight calluses of a man who practiced with weapons he would never need to use in earnest. The hand of a man whose choices had been protected for so long by his position that they had ceased, at some level, to be choices at all. She looked at it for exactly 1 breath longer than the social contract allowed. Then she took it. She danced the last waltz of the royal masquerade with Crown Duke Adrian Blackthorn, and she did it with the same composed grace she had done everything else all evening. His hand at her waist. The measured distance the court observed. The music, slow and formal and beautiful, conducting 300 people through the last civilized performance of the night. And somewhere in the room, she did not look. She would not give herself the specific position of looking. Lucien Ravenscroft watched, with his dark coat and his discarded mask and his precise, patient eyes, while the woman he had proposed to danced with the man who had not deserved her and had lost her anyway. The waltz ended. The court applauded. Seraphina removed her hand from Adrian's with the kind of care that is not tenderness but its opposite. The care of a woman who is deciding, in real time, with what precision she intends to proceed. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. And in this moment, in the aftermath of the music, in the particular quiet of a crowd that has just stopped moving, she saw something in his face that she had not seen there before. Not guilt, not the guilt of a man who has been caught. Something older and less articulate. The expression of a man recognizing, very late, that the thing he had been treating as a constant was operating on different terms than he understood. "Seraphina," he started. "Good night, Adrian," she said. She left the ballroom. She did not look for Lucien. She did not need to. The proposal was in her chest like a stone she had picked up without deciding whether to keep it, turning it over in the dark, feeling its weight, measuring the distance between where she was standing and where throwing it would take her. Her carriage was brought around at midnight. She was almost to the palace entrance when she heard his voice, not Lucien, not Adrian, but her own maid, Harriet, who had been waiting in the entrance hall with a worried expression that Seraphina recognized as the expression of someone who had been receiving information from the servant networks, which were, as always, approximately 3 hours ahead of whatever the aristocracy thought they were concealing. "My lady," Harriet's voice was very carefully neutral. "There's something you should know before the morning." Seraphina looked at her. "Lord Arden arrived at the palace this evening," Harriet said. "He had a private meeting with the Crown Duke 2 hours ago, in the council chamber." A pause. Several of the palace staff heard raised voices. Seraphina was still. "And," Harriet continued, her tone shifting to the register of news that requires careful delivery, "Lady Celeste Arden apparently returned to the palace in some distress approximately 40 minutes ago. The Arden family's carriage was seen leaving through the western gate." Another pause, shorter this time. "But Lady Celeste herself did not leave with it." The entrance hall's candlelight was very steady, very clear. "Where's Lady Celeste now?" Seraphina asked. Harriet looked at her with the expression of a woman who is about to say something she would prefer not to say. "She's been given quarters in the private wing," Harriet said. "Third floor, the rooms that are—" She stopped. Then, "The rooms that are typically reserved for family." The palace entrance hall was very quiet. The music from the ballroom had stopped. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed with the specific sound of something being sealed. Seraphina stood very still in the candlelight, in her ivory gown and her pearl and obsidian mask still held in her left hand, and felt the final piece of the evening's architecture settle into place with the cold, definitive weight of something that has always been true and has only now, in this particular moment, stopped bothering to conceal itself. The Arden family had not simply ensnared a man, they had been running something far longer and far deeper. And Adrian Blackthorn, Crown Duke, heir apparent, the man she had built 5 years around, was either their victim, their instrument, or the thing she had most feared from the very beginning of recognizing what she was actually seeing. She did not yet know which, but she understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones like winter, that by morning the information Harriet had just given her would have traveled, in one form or another, to the 2 most powerful men in the kingdom, one of whom had her dancing the last waltz in his mind as a warning he'd failed to deliver, and one of whom was waiting, with his patient, calculated eyes, for her answer. She put on her mask, not the pearl and obsidian one, that she tucked into her evening bag with the deliberateness of a woman closing a chapter. The other one, the one she wore every day, the one that had kept her upright through 5 years of careful survival. She walked out of the palace into the cool autumn night, into her carriage, into the dark, and by the time the wheels began to turn, she had already decided. What Seraphina Vale did not know, could not yet know, was that the raised voices in the council chamber had not been about Celeste Arden at all. They had been about a document that, if made public, would not merely humiliate the Crown Duke. It would bring down half the royal council, destroy 3 of the kingdom's most powerful noble houses, and expose a conspiracy that had been operating behind the architecture of the court for a decade. A document that, by the following morning, would be missing from the council chamber entirely, and that the only person who had been positioned that evening to take it was someone who had spent the entire masquerade not in the ballroom, not in a garden pavilion, but in a room where no one had thought to look for him, doing the one thing he had always been most dangerous doing, not watching the performance, but dismantling the stage. The morning arrived the way consequences usually do, quietly, without announcement, with the particular quality of light that suggests the world has continued its rotation regardless of what you decided the night before. Seraphina was awake before dawn. She had not slept in the conventional sense. She had lain in the dark of her chambers in the Vale townhouse and run the numbers. Not the emotional accounting, not yet, but the structural one. The kind of calculation her father had taught her before the Arden family had taken his ability to teach her anything further. Assets, vulnerabilities, positions on the board. The way a woman who has been told repeatedly that she is too serious, too analytical, too much like a man who reads balance sheets instead of embroidery patterns, thinks when the performance is finally over and there is no one watching. By the time the first gray light appeared at the edge of her curtains, she had finished. She called for Harriet at 5:30. "I need to know everything," she said, "that the household staff has collected since last night. Not the polished version, the actual version." Harriet, who had served the Vale family for 11 years, and had the specific competence of a woman who understood that information was the only currency that never depreciated, sat down in the chair across from the vanity without being invited. This alone told Seraphina that what was coming required the weight of a chair under it. "Lady Celeste is still in the private wing," Harriet said. "She has not left. Lord Arden sent a messenger to the palace at 6 this morning and received no reply." A pause that had specific gravity to it. "The Crown Duke has not been seen in the private apartment since midnight. His valet reports he was in the council chamber until 3 in the morning." "Alone?" "No." Harriet's voice flattened slightly. "Duke Ravenscroft's secretary was seen entering the palace through the servants' gate at approximately 1:30. He departed at 2:45 carrying a leather satchel." Seraphina looked at her reflection in the vanity mirror without actually seeing it. "Duke Ravenscroft's secretary," she said. "Yes. Not the Duke himself." "Not the Duke himself." Harriet folded her hands in her lap with the composure of a woman delivering a story she finds deeply interesting and is choosing, professionally, not to show it. Although 3 separate sources confirmed that Duke Ravenscroft's personal carriage was positioned on the street adjacent to the palace's north wall between midnight and 2 in the morning, the gray light was getting stronger. Outside, the city was beginning its early sounds. The carts, the vendors, the specific percussion of a capital waking itself up for commerce. Seraphina picked up her hairbrush and ran it through her hair once, twice, 3 times. Not from vanity, but from the physical discipline of doing something with her hands while her mind moved. "The document," she said. "Do we know what it contains?" "Not specifically." Harriet's voice was careful in the way of someone who knows approximately and is choosing precision over approximation. "The household network suggests it involves correspondence, old correspondence spanning several years, between certain members of the royal council and the Arden family's commercial interests in the Northern Territories." Seraphina set the brush down. The Northern Territories. Her father's commercial interests had been in the Northern Territories. The trade agreements that Lord Arden's legal campaign had dismantled had been in the Northern Territories. The network her father had spent 30 years building, which had come apart in 18 months of courtroom maneuvering that everyone in the nobility had accepted as legitimate competition rather than looking at the mechanism behind it. She had always known there was a mechanism. She had spent 5 years not asking about it directly, because asking directly required acknowledging that the man she was positioned beside might be part of the architecture of what had been done to her family, and that acknowledgement was incompatible with the arrangement she had been sustaining. "Get me dressed," she said. "The gray wool. Not the court gray. The working gray." Harriet stood without comment. An hour later, Seraphina Vale arrived at Ravenscroft House on the city's western edge, unannounced, without a card, wearing the gray wool she used when she intended to be taken seriously rather than decoratively, and told the footman at the door that she required 10 minutes of the Duke's time. The footman, a young man with the precise posture of someone recently trained to it, blinked once. "The Duke is not receiving callers this morning, my lady." "I know," she said. "Tell him Lady Seraphina Vale is at the door, and that I said to tell him specifically the Northern Territories." The footman processed this for approximately 2 seconds, then executed the fastest exit from a doorway she had ever observed in a man trained to move slowly. She waited on the front step. The house was not what she had expected. She had constructed Ravenscroft House in her imagination from the court's descriptions. Something severe and cold, stone walls and no flowers. The residence of a man who had traded warmth for effectiveness. What she found instead was a building that was simply serious, not cold. Serious. The difference, she thought, was in the intention. Cold architecture wanted you to feel small. This architecture wanted to make clear that what happened inside it mattered. The footman returned in under 3 minutes. "The Duke will see you in the study." The study was on the 2nd floor, at the back of the house, facing a garden that had been designed by someone who understood the difference between decorative and functional. The plants were arranged for what they could produce, not for how they appeared, which gave the whole thing the specific beauty of something that had not been trying to be beautiful and had achieved it anyway. Lucien Ravenscroft was standing when she entered. Not seated behind the desk, not positioned in the deliberate arrangement of a man preparing to receive someone across a formal distance. Standing by the window with his jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled to the forearm, a cup of what appeared to be black coffee that he clearly wasn't drinking held in his left hand. He looked like a man in the middle of working who had stopped and had not yet decided whether to resume. He looked at her for a moment. "You heard about the satchel," he said. "I heard about the satchel. My secretary is going to hear about the inadvisability of being seen." "Your secretary was seen by people who are paid specifically to see things," she said. "That's not his failure. That's the ambient intelligence of the city." She looked around the study, not with the performative admiration of a social caller, but with the direct assessment of a woman cataloging a space for information. Books, organized by subject rather than presentation, maps on one wall, pinned with small markers in 3 different colors, a desk that held the evidence of actual use, papers in ordered but not decorative stacks, 2 inkwells, a letter in progress whose content she deliberately did not read. "You were outside the palace last night?" "Yes." "You sent your secretary in with a satchel and waited?" "Yes." "What was in the satchel going in?" she said. "And what was in it coming out?" He set the coffee down on the windowsill with the specific care of a man who has been holding something he forgot he was holding. He looked at her with those dark, assessing eyes, and did not, she noted, perform the customary social delay of a man deciding whether to trust someone. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the garden, like the question of trust had already been resolved, and what remained was purely the mechanics of delivery. "Going in," he said, "documents establishing the legal framework for a petition to the Royal Council. The kind of petition that requires certain procedural groundwork to be laid before it can be filed." He moved away from the window, and she noticed that he moved the way people move when they're accustomed to rooms being the right size for them, regardless of whether they actually were. Coming out, confirmation that the groundwork was received. "You've been preparing a council petition," she said. "I've been preparing a council petition for 14 months. Against the Arden family." He looked at her steadily. "Against the network the Arden family represents. The family itself is an instrument. The network is the target." She felt something shift in her chest with the specific quality of a door being opened that she had locked a long time ago for structural reasons, and was now finding, in the new light of this particular morning, did not need to stay locked. "My father's trade agreements," she said, "were not lost because of legitimate commercial competition." His voice carried no inflection of apology, which she found she preferred to the alternative. Apology would have made it personal. This made it factual, which meant it could be acted on. They were dismantled through a coordinated campaign of legal manipulation that had been funded, at various points, through channels that connect to 4 members of the current Royal Council. The room was very quiet. "You have documentation," she said. "I have significant documentation. Not all of it is—" He paused. "Not all of it is yet in a condition to be presented to the Council without being challenged." "What condition is it in?" "Convincing to anyone who is already inclined to believe it. Insufficient to compel anyone who is politically motivated to dismiss it." She understood the problem immediately. It was the problem her father had faced, and his lawyers, and the 2 advisors she had quietly consulted herself over the years. The distance between knowing and proving was not a legal distance, but a political one, and political distance required different instruments than legal ones. "What does Adrian's involvement look like?" she asked. Something changed in his face. Not softening, not hardening, but the specific adjustment of a man recalibrating the terms of a conversation he'd thought he'd mapped. "You're asking whether he's a perpetrator or a hostage," he said. "I'm asking what the document says." He was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted them, because she had learned early that what people did with silence was more informative than what they did with speech. "The document," he said, "suggests that the Crown Duke has been aware of the Arden family's methods for a period of approximately 2 years. The nature of his awareness is interpretable. Interpretable as complicity or interpretable as coercion. Both readings are supportable with the available evidence." She walked to the chair nearest the window, not the guest chair positioned across from the desk, which was the chair of someone receiving an audience, but the chair beside the bookshelf, which was the chair of someone staying, and sat down in it with the deliberateness of a woman making a physical statement. "Celeste Arden is in the private wing," she said. "Her family sent a messenger this morning that was ignored. The Crown Duke spent last night in the council chamber." She looked at him. "How long has he known that the Arden family has been using his relationship with Celeste as leverage?" Lucien sat down behind the desk, not performing the authority of the position, just using the surface. He pulled one of the document stacks toward him, looked at the top page, pushed it aside. Long enough, he said, that when he considers his options, the woman he has treated most carelessly is also, by an unfortunate coincidence, the woman he now needs most. The words landed in the room like something physical. She heard them not just in their content, but in their architecture, the specific shape of what he was telling her, which was that Adrian's sudden awareness of what he had lost was not only or primarily romantic, that the regret she would likely be presented with had dimensions that extended beyond the personal, that the man who had kissed Celeste Arden in a garden pavilion while Seraphina waited faithfully in a ballroom was not merely a man who had chosen badly. He was a man who was now calculating what it would cost him to fix it, and who had looked at the ledger and found her name in the credit column. "He's going to come to me," she said, "almost certainly by this afternoon. He'll present it as remorse. He is, I think, genuinely remorseful." Lucien's voice was precise. "That's not incompatible with the remorse being useful to him." She absorbed this. She held it alongside the memory of Adrian's hand on her wrist at the masquerade, the proprietary ease of it, the way his eyes had done their calibration in the pause she had given him. She held it alongside 5 years of patient, careful investment in a man who had been, at some level she had been protecting herself from seeing, always dividing his attention in ways she had chosen to attribute to the demands of his position rather than the nature of his choices. "You asked me last night to consider your proposal," she said. "I did. I've considered it." The study was very quiet. Through the window, the garden moved slightly in an early morning wind, the functional plants going about the business of being alive. "My answer is yes," she said. Lucien looked at her across the desk for a long moment. She watched his face do the same thing it had done in the garden, that barely there shift, less than an expression and more than its absence. The change of a man who has calculated odds and finds that the actual outcome is different from even a favorable projection. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain of very little this morning," she said. "I'm certain of this. You understand what accepting means. The court will decide its revenge. Adrian will—" "I know what Adrian will do," she said. "I've been studying Adrian Blackthorn for 5 years. I know his resources and his instincts and the specific way he responds when he believes something he considered secured has been removed from his possession." She looked at Lucien steadily. "What I want to know is what your proposal actually requires of me, not the public version. The actual structure of what you're asking." He leaned back in the chair, not relaxing, but the posture of a man choosing to be legible. "I require," he said, "a partner with the Vale family's network in the Western Territories, access to the commercial relationships your father established before they were dismantled, and a public alliance that creates sufficient political weight to present the council petition without it being buried in procedural challenge." He paused. "In return, you receive the protection of the Ravenscroft name, the resources of this house, and a husband who will not manage you." "Not manage me," she said. "That's a specific phrasing. It's a specific promise. Most men who promise not to manage women have not examined what managing actually means." "I've examined it," he said. "I have no interest in a wife whose effectiveness requires my approval to operate. That's not usefulness. That's decoration." His voice had the quality of a man who had thought about this not as a romantic principle, but as a functional one, the way you think about the structural requirements of a working partnership. "I need someone who operates independently and with judgment. Constraining that would be self-defeating." She looked at him for a moment. "The petition," she said. "When does it go to the council?" 3 weeks, possibly 2, depending on how the political landscape shifts in the next 72 hours. The Arden family will resist it. Significantly. They'll use Adrian. They'll try. And if Adrian chooses them over— She stopped, reconstructed. "If Adrian's political survival requires aligning with the Arden network rather than severing from it," Lucien's eyes were very still. "Then he makes that choice, and the petition goes forward regardless, and he becomes part of the exposure rather than an instrument of it." She heard the cold architecture of it. Not cruel, but absolute. The thing the court most feared about Lucien Ravenscroft was not his ruthlessness, but his capacity to hold a course regardless of what the holding cost. The ability to pursue a line of action to its conclusion without the emotional interference that caused other powerful men to flinch at the decisive moment. She had heard this described as coldness. Sitting across from him in his working study on a gray autumn morning, she recognized it as something different. It was the specific toughness of a man who had learned, at a level below strategy, that flinching was its own kind of violence. She understood it. She had her own version of it. "I'll need access to my father's original contract records," she said. "I have copies, but the originals are held by the Vale family solicitor. I'll have them transferred to your legal team by the end of the week." "That's helpful. I'll also need—" She paused. "I'll need to manage the announcement carefully, not for vanity reasons, for strategic ones. The court's first interpretation will be revenge, as you said. If that interpretation stabilizes, it limits the political weight of the alliance. The announcement needs to be timed and framed so that the council's first reading is strength, not reaction." He looked at her with the particular quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as his form of approval, which was not warmth exactly, but was the specific engagement of a man who had found something that worked as expected and was not going to make a speech about it. "I was thinking," he said, "the Royal Engagement Banquet, 3 weeks from today. The same event where you plan to file the petition's preliminary paperwork. Adjacent events create narrative," he said. "The court interprets adjacent events as connected even when they're not. When they actually are connected, the interpretation does significant work for you." She thought about this. She thought about the specifics of it, the timing, the optics, the way 300 aristocratic minds would process the simultaneous information of a Vale Ravenscroft engagement announcement and a council petition targeting the Arden family's network. The way those two data points would be assembled into a story. The story they would be assembled into. "It'll be described as my revenge," she said. "Let them," he said. "Women who take effective action are always described as acting from emotion. The description does nothing to the effectiveness of the action." She was quiet for a moment. Something in her chest did something she had not expected. Not the lock-turning sensation of the night before, but something different. Something that felt less like a door and more like a foundation settling. The specific sensation of weight being distributed correctly across a structure that had been compensating for uneven load for a very long time. "There's one more thing," she said. "Yes." "Adrian will come to me today. You said so yourself." "Yes. When he does," she said, "I need to know whether the Arden family's leverage on him is the kind that can be neutralized or the kind that requires his full cooperation to survive." She looked at Lucien directly. "Because if he's genuinely coerced, if the blackmail is real and the threat is structural, then the way we handle him determines whether the council petition damages the monarchy along with the Arden network. And I won't be responsible for that." The room was quiet for a beat that had specific weight in it. "That," Lucien said, "is exactly the right question. Is it one you can answer?" "Not yet." He held her gaze. "But within 48 hours, I'll have enough to answer it." A pause. "Will you wait for the answer before you decide how to handle Adrian's approach?" She considered. She thought about the carriage ride home through the dark, about the decision she had made before the wheels had finished turning, about the specific quality of that decision. Not impulsive, not reactive, but the calculated closing of one structure in preparation for building another. "I'll listen to what he says," she said. "I won't commit to anything, and I'll tell you exactly what he tells me." Lucien looked at her across the working desk in the serious house with its functional garden and its maps pinned in 3 colors. "Then we have an agreement," he said. She stood. He stood. They looked at each other across the distance of the desk, which was neither the theatrical distance of adversaries nor the reduced distance of people who have decided on intimacy, but the specific workable distance of 2 people who have agreed on something real and are taking a moment to register the weight of it. "One question," she said at the door. "Yes, last night, in the garden." She kept her voice even, professional. "You said you had been watching me for 5 years." She looked at him over her shoulder, and she asked it not with the softness of a woman who wanted a particular answer, but with the directness of a woman who had learned in the last 12 hours that she had been accepting performances in place of facts for long enough. "What were you waiting for?" Lucien Ravenscroft stood behind his desk in his shirt sleeves in the gray morning light, and for the first time since she had entered the room, she saw something in his face that was not calculation and was not assessment and was not the controlled deployment of information. He said, "For you to stop waiting for him to deserve you." She turned and walked out. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard the front door of Ravenscroft House open below her. Not her exit, which she had not yet reached, but the servants' entrance at the bottom of the east corridor. A different kind of opening, followed by rapid footsteps and a voice she recognized immediately, low and urgent and stripped of every layer of court polish it usually wore. "Tell him I need to speak with Ravenscroft directly," the voice said. "Tell him it's about the document. Tell him Adrian Blackthorn sent me." Seraphina stopped on the staircase. The footsteps below were those of a messenger, young, fast, clearly instructed to convey the urgency of whoever had sent him. She heard the footman's murmured response. She heard the pause as the message was being considered. She stood very still on the stairs, her hand on the banister, and understood in the specific way of a woman who has spent 5 years learning to read the architecture behind the performance that the thing she had thought would happen this afternoon had already been set in motion. That Adrian Blackthorn, who had spent last night in the council chamber, had woken this morning to find that his calculation of the board was different from what he'd expected. That he had looked at the positions of the pieces, Celeste in the private wing, the satchel that had moved through the palace in the small hours, the silence from the Arden family's messenger, and had arrived at the same conclusion she had, which was that the center of the board had shifted overnight, and that the position he needed, the position he had been taking for granted for 5 years, was no longer unoccupied. She walked down the remaining stairs into the entrance hall. The messenger was 17, perhaps 18, with the look of someone chosen for speed over discretion and currently discovering that those were not the same qualification. He saw her. His face performed a rapid series of adjustments that suggested he recognized her and was recalibrating in real time whether her presence here was information he was authorized to receive. She looked at him with the same composure she had looked at everything this morning, clear, direct, the expression of a woman who is no longer in the business of making things easier for men who need to figure out where she stood. "Tell the Crown Duke," she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "that Lady Seraphina Vale is not available this afternoon." The messenger stared at her. "And tell him," she said, "that if he wishes to understand why, he should ask Lord Arden what document is missing from the council chamber." She walked past him, out the front door, into the gray autumn morning, into the city that was going about its business without awareness that the board had just changed. Behind her, in the study on the second floor, Lucien Ravenscroft stood at the window and watched her carriage pull away with the expression of a man who has spent a very long time being certain of very little, and has found, in the last 60 minutes, one thing worth being certain about. And in the royal palace, 3 streets east, Crown Duke Adrian Blackthorn received a message back that was not the message he had sent, and read it twice, and understood that he had made the specific, irreversible category of mistake that cannot be corrected, only survived. The point of no return had passed in the dark, quiet as a door closing, while everyone who mattered was still deciding whether to walk through it. The announcement hit the court like a stone dropped into still water. Not the engagement itself, though that was sufficient to generate 3 days of sustained aristocratic agitation, but the timing of it. The way the news arrived not through the customary channels of formal correspondence and social calls, but through the specific, unstoppable velocity of the city's information networks, moving from the Vale townhouse to the Callaway Palace to every significant drawing room in the capital within the space of 6 hours, carrying with it the particular charge of something that had not been managed or softened or framed for consumption. Lady Seraphina Vale and Duke Lucien Ravenscroft. Engaged. The court's collective response was, essentially, a held breath. Seraphina spent the first day receiving callers with the composed precision of a woman who had anticipated every reaction and had prepared a response calibrated to each. Lady Westmore arrived at 10 in the morning wearing an expression that combined sincere concern with intense curiosity in the specific ratio of a woman who had come for information and was presenting the curiosity as the concern. Lord Harrington's wife came at noon. 2 of the Vale family's oldest allies, families who had stood beside her father before the Arden campaign had made standing beside the Vale name a costly social choice, arrived separately in the afternoon, and their visits carried a different quality. Quieter, more deliberate. The visits of people recalculating a ledger. She told them nothing they couldn't confirm elsewhere. She told them she was happy. She told them the engagement was her choice. She told them, in the precise language of a woman who has spent years deploying the court's own vocabulary back at it, that she had every confidence in Duke Ravenscroft's character and every reason for optimism about her future. She told them this with the complete steadiness of a woman who had made a decision she intended to honor and who was also, in the separate operational part of her mind, waiting. Adrian did not come the first day. She had expected this. A man who sent a messenger to his political enemy's house and received her name back as the answer understood, at the level of instinct that political survival produced, that the direct approach required better footing than he currently had. He would be assessing, calculating the leverage available to him and the leverage available to her, and the specific geometry of a situation in which the woman he had underestimated had moved to an entirely different board position overnight. He came on the second morning, not announced, not with the formal courtesy of a card and a scheduled call. He arrived at the Vale townhouse at 9 o'clock with 2 outriders and the particular bearing of a man exercising a claim he was not entirely certain was still valid, which Seraphina recognized immediately, and which told her more about his current state than anything his face was doing. She received him into the front parlor. Not the formal reception room, that was the room for people she intended to impress or intimidate, and not the private sitting room, which was the room for people she trusted. The front parlor was the room of transaction, neutral ground with good light and no comfortable chairs. He looked at her for a moment from the doorway. 5 years. She had looked at this face for 5 years, and she had the absolute and detailed knowledge of it that sustained proximity produces, the line of his jaw, the particular way exhaustion sat in his eyes, the micro-adjustments his expression made when he was managing something he didn't want visible. She could read him. She had always been able to read him. What she had spent 5 years choosing not to do was act on what she read. "Seraphina," he said. "Adrian," she said, "sit down." Huck sat. He did it with the slightly careful quality of a man who understood that the social architecture of this room had been deliberately chosen and was choosing not to challenge it. This alone told her the calculus had shifted since the masquerade. Adrian Blackthorn did not accommodate arrangements unless the alternative was worse than accommodation. "The engagement," he said. "Yes." "You made the decision quickly." "I made the decision," she said, "with the information available to me, which was comprehensive." His jaw tightened by a fraction. "I need you to understand something about the last 2 years, about Celeste and about the situation with the Arden family." "You need me to understand that you were coerced," she said. He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was not quite relief and was not quite shame, and landed somewhere in the specific territory of a man discovering that the person he underestimated had already mapped the terrain he was trying to navigate her through. "Yes," he said. "The correspondence they hold. It goes back to my father's administration. There are decisions, council decisions, that were made in ways that could be used to destabilize the current ministry. The Arden family has been leveraging access to that correspondence for years." He leaned forward. The posture of a man asking for something and knowing it. "What I felt for Celeste was real, at the beginning. I need you to know that. But the reason the relationship continued past the point where it should have ended, the reason I could never cleanly—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. She looked at him with the clear, direct attention she had been developing her entire adult life, which was the attention of a woman who has learned that what people say and what they mean exist in different registers, and that the gap between them is where the actual information lives. "I believe you were coerced," she said. "I believe the Arden family holds material that represents a genuine threat to the monarchy's stability, and that they have been using that material for leverage with significant effectiveness." She paused. "I also believe that you made choices within that coercion that you were not required to make. That there were moments, multiple moments, when you could have come to me, or to the council, or to any one of several people who would have had both the motivation and the resources to help you address it, and you chose instead to manage it quietly, in a way that preserved your position and cost me mine." The room was quiet. He started. "That's the accurate version," she said. "I'm not angry, Adrian. I want you to understand that. I'm not sitting here with 5 years of accumulated grievance looking for an outlet. I'm sitting here with 5 years of accumulated information and a very clear understanding of what was done and what it cost. And I'm telling you the accurate version of it because I think you have spent enough time in rooms where people tell you convenient versions." I was silent for a long moment. She watched him process it, not the denial of a man who intended to argue, but the specific silence of a man who had been handed a mirror and was deciding whether to look directly into it. "What do you want?" he said. His voice had changed, stripped of the performance. "From you specifically? Very little," she said. "From the situation? I want the Arden Network's hold on the council dismantled, I want the families it damaged, mine included, to have their losses acknowledged through legitimate process. And I want whatever happens in the next 3 weeks to happen in a way that doesn't destabilize the monarchy, because I am not interested in being the mechanism of institutional collapse. That's not revenge. That's the outcome I'm willing to work toward. You're working with Ravenscroft, he said. Not an accusation, a statement finding its shape. Yes. His petition to the council is 14 months of careful preparation. She looked at him steadily. He's been building this case since before the masquerade, before last week. Before any of this became, she gestured slightly with one hand, indicating the parlor, the visit, the new arrangement of all the pieces, what it currently is. Adrian stood up. He moved to the window. The same instinct she'd had in Lucien's study, the need for motion when the ground was uncertain, and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched the line of his shoulders doing the specific work of a man who was not performing composure, but was actually, in real time, making a decision. The correspondence, he said. If Ravenscroft's petition proceeds without the Arden family being handled first, if they feel cornered and they release the correspondence publicly, then it releases, she said, and the council deals with it, and the monarchy survives it, because monarchies that cannot survive the exposure of their past councils are already structurally compromised in ways that the exposure itself is not responsible for. He turned. He looked at her. And this look was different from every look she had catalogued over 5 years. Not the comfortable assessment of a man looking at a piece of his own landscape. Something rawer. The look of a man who has removed the architecture of his assumptions and is looking at something with the unmediated clarity that is usually only available after the damage is done. You've changed, he said. No, she said. You've seen me clearly for the first time, which is different. He left 20 minutes later. Not with a resolution, not with an agreement, but with the particular quality of departure that suggested a man who had arrived to negotiate and had discovered that the terms were already set, and that his most viable option was to decide how he intended to position himself in relation to terms he could not alter. She watched his carriage leave from the parlor window and thought about what she had not told him. She had not told him about the specific content of the correspondence that Lucien's team had been working to obtain. She had not told him about the third category of documents, not the Arden family's leverage material, not the Vale family's trade records, but a third set, referenced in Lucien's legal preparation, that she had identified in the documentation she'd reviewed the previous evening and had not yet asked Lucien to explain directly. Documents that named, in addition to the 4 council members she already knew about, a 5th signatory. She had spent the night reading the legal preparation materials Lucien had given her access to. She had read them with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that her name was now attached to this enterprise, and that she was not in the practice of attaching her name to things she had not fully examined. She had read everything. 300 pages of carefully assembled evidence, correspondence analysis, financial trail documentation, and legal argument, assembled over 14 months with the precision of a man who intended to win. And on page 247, in a section cross-referencing the financial instruments used to fund the campaign against the Vale family's northern trade interests, she had found a name she recognized. Not the Arden family, not the council members, not any of the architects she had already identified. Aldrich Brone, her father's oldest legal advisor, the man who had handled the Vale family's legal defense during the 18-month campaign, the man who had, by his own account, fought for their interests at every turn and lost, the man who, according to the financial trail in Lucien's documentation, had received a series of payments from an Arden-adjacent commercial account beginning 4 months before the legal campaign commenced. She had read the page 3 times. Then she had set the documents down and sat in the silence of her study and understood what it meant to discover that the person who had been standing in the room with you during the fire had been the one who'd lit it. She had not slept after that. Now, in the parlor's gray morning light, she made the decision she had been building towards since 2 in the morning. She sent for her carriage. Ravenscroft House received her with the same serious quiet as before. She was shown up to the study, where Lucien was not at the window this time, but at the desk, working, with the focused concentration of a man who treated interruption as a variable he had already accounted for rather than a disruption. He looked up when she entered. He read her face in approximately 2 seconds. "You found Brone," he said. She stopped in the center of the room. The specific sensation was not anger. It was the cold, structural shock of a floor you thought was solid discovering a void beneath it. Not the fall itself, but the moment before the fall, when your body has registered the absence of support and your mind has not yet caught up. You knew, she said. I've known for 11 months. You knew, she said again, and the second time it landed differently. Not shock, but its aftermath. The particular temperature of understanding that has been forced to skip grief and arrive directly at consequence. You built a petition that relies on my family's records and my family's network and my name, and you knew that the man who presided over my family's legal destruction was paid to lose. Yes, he said. Why didn't you tell me? It was not a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. It was the statement of a woman who was, in this specific moment, deciding what category of person she was dealing with, whether the man across the desk belonged in the same category as every other man who had managed information in ways that served his interests at the cost of hers, or whether there was a distinction available that she could, in good conscience, make. Lucien set down his pen. He stood. He did not come around the desk. He kept the surface between them, which she recognized as a deliberate choice, the choice of a man who understood that reducing physical distance in this moment would read as manipulation and was choosing not to. Because, he said, when I found Brown in the financial trail, I was 11 months from being able to act on it. And the action required, the specific action of exposing a man your father trusted, who sat in your family's council during the worst period of your family's recent history, was not information I could give you without either forcing you into premature action or asking you to carry it alone while I finished building the case. He paused. I made a decision. I decided the case needed to be complete before the information was useful, that an incomplete case with that particular knowledge in it was more dangerous than a complete case that hadn't yet reached you. That was your decision to make, she said. Yes, he said. It was. And I made it. And I'm telling you now that I made it, and I'm telling you the reasoning, and I'm not going to tell you it was the right call because I don't know if it was. I know it was the call I made. She stood in the center of the room and breathed. She thought about Brown. She thought about his face at the end of the legal proceedings, the specific expression of a man who had just delivered bad news that he had known was coming, the rehearsed quality of his condolences, the way he had held her father's hand with the warmth of a man whose grief was real. She had believed the grief. She had cataloged it as one of the few genuine things in an 18-month period characterized by performance. She had been wrong, and the wrongness of it had a specific texture, not the texture of naivete, but of deliberate, targeted deception aimed at a point of trust so foundational she had not thought to armor it. I need to ask you something, she said. Yes. And I need you to answer it without the version that protects the case. He looked at her. All right. Is there anything else, she said, in those 300 pages that involves my family specifically that I have not yet read? The room was very quiet. And in that quiet, in the specific quality of the pause before he answered, not the pause of a man constructing a lie, but the pause of a man deciding the exact shape of a truth that had weight to it, she knew. There's a letter, he said, cross-referenced in the supplemental documents, Section 4. He moved around the desk then, not toward her but to the document cabinet along the wall, which he opened with a key from his jacket pocket. He withdrew a single folder, thin, and held it for a moment. It was written by your father, 8 months before the legal campaign began. He set the folder on the desk between them. It was written to Aldrich Brown. She looked at the folder. It outlines, Lucien said, his voice carrying the specific flatness of a man delivering information he would have preferred not to deliver. A series of financial decisions your father made in the 6 months prior. Decisions that, in retrospect, created the vulnerabilities the Arden campaign exploited. He paused. The letter asks Brown to help conceal those vulnerabilities from the Council's Oversight Committee. She stared at the folder. My father, she said, made decisions under significant financial pressure that he chose to manage privately rather than transparently. Those decisions gave the Arden family the specific legal leverage they needed to dismantle the trade agreements. He was very still. He was not in conspiracy with them. He didn't know what they intended to do with the vulnerability he'd created. But the vulnerability was real, and it was made, and Brown knew about it because your father trusted him with it. The parlor had been neutral ground. This room had no ground at all. She picked up the folder. She opened it. She read her father's handwriting, the precise, slightly forward-leaning script she had grown up watching produce correspondence and contracts, and the careful records of a man who built things methodically and loved them completely. And she read what he had asked for, and she understood in the full, unmediated, unprotected way that she had spent 5 years avoiding, that the story of her family's destruction was not the story she had been carrying. It was more complicated. It was more human. It was the story of a man who had made mistakes under pressure and had trusted the wrong person to help him carry them, and had not known until it was too late that the person he trusted had already been purchased by the people waiting to use those mistakes as weapons. Her father had not been ruined by his enemies alone. He had been ruined by his own choices, and by a trusted advisor who had been paid to make those choices as ruinous as possible. She set the letter down. She stood in Lucien Ravenscroft's study, with the folder open on the desk between them, and felt the specific, total collapse of a narrative she had been living inside for 5 years. Not just the narrative of Adrian's betrayal, not just the narrative of the Arden family's malice, but the foundational narrative, the one she had built her entire identity of survival upon, the story of an innocent family destroyed by pure external corruption, whose daughter had done everything right and been wronged by forces entirely outside her control. That story was not false, but it was not complete. And the incompleteness of it, the human, complicated, painful incompleteness, was the thing that the Arden family had been counting on her never finding out. They knew, she said. Her voice came out different, not broken, stripped. The Arden family knew about the letter. That's why Brone was purchased before the campaign started. That's why the legal strategy was so specifically targeted. They weren't exploiting a vulnerability they discovered. They were exploiting a vulnerability they helped create. Yes, Lucien said, and Brone has this letter. He has the original. We have a copy, obtained through... He stopped. The copy is in this folder. The original is in Brone's possession and has been his insurance policy for 5 years. She closed the folder. She looked at Lucien Ravenscroft across the desk and understood something she had not been prepared to understand when she walked into this house 20 minutes ago. The petition, the 300 pages, the 14 months, the carefully assembled case, was not sufficient. It was comprehensive. It was accurate. It was, in the specific landscape of the Royal Council's political mechanics, extraordinarily well built. But Brone with the original letter could, at the moment of maximum exposure, introduce her father's culpability into the public record and reframe the entire narrative. Not as a corrupt advisor serving a corrupt network, as a loyal advisor protecting his employer's confidential decisions, being targeted by a politically motivated duke and his vengeful fiancée, using a dead man's mistakes as a sword. The case that had seemed, 2 days ago, like the architecture of something solid was a trap, and she had walked into it with her name, her family's records, and the weight of her public engagement attached to it. Her first instinct, the old one, the one that had kept her functional through 5 years of careful positioning, was to calculate an exit. The specific cold efficiency of a woman who had learned early that cutting a loss before it compounded was its own form of strength. Her second instinct arrived 3 seconds later, and it was different. She looked at Lucien. He was watching her with those still, dark eyes, not with the calculation she had initially misread as coldness, and had gradually come to understand as something closer to the specific attention of a man who was interested in what she actually was rather than what was convenient for her to be. He was watching her face do the work of a woman who had just had the ground removed from under her and was deciding in real time what she intended to build on the void. He had not warned her. He had not protected her from this. He had given her the full picture at the moment she was capable of using it, not before, and the decision about whether that was something she could accept was the most honest decision she had faced in 5 years. How much time, she said, before Brone realizes that you have the copy? Something shifted in Lucien's face. Not surprise exactly, but the specific quality of a man who has presented someone with the worst information available and is watching them decide to advance rather than retreat. Based on his current contact pattern with the Arden network, he said, 72 hours, possibly less. And the petition filing at the engagement banquet, that's 18 days away. Yes. So the window in which we can approach Brone before he knows we have leverage on him is approximately 3 days. Yes, he said. She picked up the folder. She held it with the same careful deliberateness she had held everything this morning. Not the grip of a woman in distress, but the grip of a woman who has decided that the thing she is holding is a tool rather than a weight. Then we need to move faster than the plan, she said. And I need to be the one who speaks to Brone directly. Lucien looked at her. That is significantly more dangerous than— I know what it is, she said. I'm the only one he won't see coming. I'm the grieving daughter. I'm the woman who spent 5 years in the dark. He has spent 5 years managing his guilt in relation to my face, which means he has spent 5 years rehearsing a version of himself that is comfortable in my presence. She held his gaze. That comfort is the only undefended position he has. And I am done, she said quietly, with the specific finality of a woman who has just burned the last version of herself that required protection, being the version of me that people are comfortable with. The 72-hour clock was already running, and somewhere across the city, in an office on the 3rd floor of the council building's legal annex, Aldrich Brone was receiving a message, not from Seraphina, not from Lucien, but from a name she would not learn until the following morning. That would tell him, 12 hours ahead of schedule, that the copy existed, that the woman he had helped ruin had found it, and that the Duke she had agreed to marry was not the most dangerous person in the room anymore. The message reached Lucien at 11:40 that night. I was still at the desk when his secretary knocked twice in the specific pattern that meant the information could not wait until morning. Seraphina had left 2 hours prior. The folder with her father's letter was still on the desk between the document stacks, exactly where she had set it down before she walked out, not in distress, not in retreat, but with the particular deliberateness of a woman who had decided that what she was walking toward required both hands free. Lucien read the message twice. Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and went to find the one man in the city who could tell him exactly how badly the board had just shifted. Marcus Vale was Lucien's oldest operative, not a spy in the court's romantic conception of the word, but a former council clerk who had spent 20 years developing the specific skill set of a man who understood that the most dangerous information in any institution lived not in the official records, but in the gap between what was documented and what was decided. He operated out of a building near the commercial district that presented itself as a shipping ledger office and functioned as something considerably more useful. I was awake when Lucien arrived. He was always awake. Lucien had never been entirely certain Marcus slept. How did Brone find out? Lucien said without preamble, standing in the doorway of the ledger office with the night air still on his coat. Marcus looked at him with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific question and had not been looking forward to delivering the answer. Harrow, he said. The name landed in the room with the specific weight of something that had been suspended for a long time, finally making contact with the floor. Harrow. Edmund Harrow. The man Lucien had brought into the petition's legal preparation 14 months ago, not as a primary architect, but as the specialist in council procedural law, who had been essential to understanding exactly how to file the preliminary paperwork in a way that could not be challenged on technical grounds. The man who had been, by every available measure, loyal, thorough, and compensated generously for both qualities. Lucien stood in the doorway of the ledger office and understood what it meant when even the architecture you built with your own hands turned out to have been load-bearing in the wrong direction. Not the understanding of a man who had been naive. He had never been naive about the cost of playing this particular game at this particular level. The understanding of a man who had assessed the risks correctly and had still, somewhere in the specific confidence of knowing what he was doing, failed to account for the variable that could not be assessed. The precise number that Harrow had decided his loyalty was worth, compared to the number the Arden network had offered him. When? Lucien said. The contact was made 6 days ago. The information transferred last night, approximately 2 hours after Lady Seraphina left your house. 2 hours. He had been sitting at his desk, reading the same documents he had read for 14 months, while the case's most critical vulnerability was being transmitted across the city in the dark. What exactly does Brone know? Lucien asked. That you have the copy, that Lady Seraphina has read it, that the engagement is real and not, Marcus paused, not the revenge arrangement that the court has been assuming it to be. He knows she's operational. He knows she read the folder. He knows she left your house without the folder, and he's smart enough to understand what that means. Lucien pulled out the chair across from Marcus's desk and sat in it. He thought about Seraphina. He thought about what she had said. I am done being the version of me that people are comfortable with. And he thought about the specific quality of that statement, which was not the statement of a woman who had decided to be reckless, but the statement of a woman who had decided to stop allowing other people's comfort to function as a constraint on her effectiveness. He thought about Brown with 12 hours of warning and the original letter and 30 years of legal experience and the specific cornered animal clarity of a man who knows that his window of safe action is closing. He'll move tonight, Lucien said. Almost certainly. The letter. He won't destroy it, Marcus said. It's been his insurance for 5 years. A man doesn't destroy 5 years of insurance because the situation gets complicated. He moves it. He opened the ledger on his desk to a page that had nothing to do with shipping and set it in front of Lucien. I have 3 probable locations. Based on his pattern of the last 6 months, I'd weight the second one highest. Lucien looked at the page. He looked at the second location. The Arden family's legal archive. Not Brown's office. Not his private residence. The one place in the city where the letter, once deposited, would be protected by the Arden family's institutional resources and would require a legal action to access rather than a personnel action. The one place that transformed a retrievable document into a fortified position. If Brown reached that archive before Lucien's people did, the letter became a weapon with institutional armor. The petition would not fail. The copy was still valid. But the Arden family would have the original in their hands, which meant they controlled the timing and framing of its release. They could hold it as a threat indefinitely. They could release it at the council session at a moment calibrated for maximum damage. They could turn a woman's dead father into a shield for the people who had destroyed him. Lucien stood. How many people do you have available tonight? He said. 4 that I trust completely, 6 that I trust adequately. I need 3 of the first category at the Arden archive within 40 minutes. Not to enter. To watch. I need to know the moment Brown's carriage arrives in that street. And then? Lucien picked up his coat. And then I go, he said. Marcus looked at him with the expression of a man who had seen Lucien Ravenscroft operate for a long time and had a clear-eyed view of both his capabilities and his limits. You understand that if Brown has already moved the letter and you're seen at the Arden archive at midnight 3 weeks before the petition filing? Yes, Lucien said. I understand what it looks like. It looks like exactly what the Arden family will describe it as. A duke conducting a criminal action against a protected legal facility. It hands them the narrative. I know what it hands them. Then why? Because, Lucien said, with the specific flatness of a man who has moved past calculation into the territory that lives on the other side of it, the alternative is letting Seraphina Vale's father be used as a weapon against her by the people who were paid to destroy him, and I'm not willing to do that. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's not a political calculation, he said. No, Lucien said, it's not. He left Marcus working the communication channels and took his carriage to the street adjacent to the Arden family's legal archive, which was a 3-story building in the city's administrative quarter, stone-faced and secure, with the specific architecture of an institution that expected to be challenged and had built accordingly. He arrived before Brown. He knew this because Marcus's first man was in position on the opposite corner, and the signal, a lantern adjusted once, told him the street was clear. He stepped out of the carriage and stood in the dark of the building's shadow and breathed the night air and thought about the nature of what he was doing. I was a duke standing outside a rival family's legal archive at midnight, waiting to intercept a document that could reshape the political landscape of the kingdom. He had no legal authority for what he was about to do. He had no institutional cover. He had the copy of the letter, which gave him the moral argument, and he had 14 months of case preparation, which gave him the strategic argument, and he had the specific, uncalculated fact that had arrived in his chest somewhere between Seraphina reading the letter and leaving without it. The fact that what he was protecting was no longer only the petition. There are moments when a man discovers that the thing he has been building has become something different from what he designed. Not worse, not weaker, but different in the way of something that has acquired weight it didn't have in the blueprint, weight that changes the nature of the structure from a construction to something that has, through the accumulation of specific particular events, become worth protecting for reasons that exist outside the original calculation. Lucien had spent a great deal of his adult life operating on calculation. He was good at it. He had survived things that broke more emotional men precisely because his capacity to separate feeling from function was extraordinary. It was the quality the court most feared about him and the quality he had most relied on. He stood in the dark outside the Arden archive and acknowledged, quietly and without drama, that the calculation was no longer the only thing operating. The second lantern signal came at 12:40. Brown's carriage arrived from the eastern street. A private vehicle, No livery. The specific anonymity of a man who knew he was conducting business. He needed to be invisible. Brone stepped out alone. He was 63 years old and moved like a man who had spent a long career sitting behind desks and had the physical vocabulary of his profession, precise, contained, not accustomed to the kind of night that required anything his body was currently being asked to provide. I was carrying a document case. Lucien stepped out of the shadow. Brone saw him from 15 feet. He stopped walking. His face, in the ambient light of the street lanterns, did the rapid sequence of adjustments that Lucien had seen on enough men in enough tight situations to read clearly. Recognition, assessment, the calculation of available options, and the specific landing point of a man who has assessed his options and found them insufficient. Duke Ravenscroft, Brone said. His voice was controlled. 20 years of legal practice had given him the ability to modulate his voice under pressure, and he was using it. Mr. Brone, Lucien said. He did not move closer. He did not need to. The geometry of the street, Lucien between Brone and the archive entrance, Marcus's men in position at both exit points, communicated everything the distance required. Brone looked at him for a moment. Whatever you think you know, Brone said, you should understand that the document in this case has been in my possession for 5 years under terms that are legally. I have the copy, Lucien said. I've had it for 11 months. Lady Seraphina has read it. He paused. She knows what her father did. She knows what you were paid to do with it. She knows the difference between those two things. Something moved through Brone's face that was not legal calculation and was not professional composure. It was older and more complicated than either of those. The expression of a man who has spent 5 years managing a specific guilt and has just been told that the person the guilt was about has found out, and that the performance of grief and loyalty he has been sustaining has been seen through, and that what awaits him on the other side of this moment is not the version of the future he was moving toward. She won't use it, Brone said. His voice had changed, stripped of the professional layer. She won't expose her father's mistakes. Whatever you've built together, she won't. You're still assessing her wrong, Lucien said. You've been assessing her wrong for 5 years. You thought she needed protection from the truth about her father. She doesn't. She needs the truth about the people who used it. He took one step forward. Give me the case. This is... Brone's voice was tightening. You understand what you're asking me to. I'm asking you to make the only choice available that doesn't end with you facing a council inquiry for colluding in the deliberate dismantling of a noble family's commercial interests under the cover of legal representation. Lucien's voice was very even, not loud. The specific register of a man who does not need volume to communicate weight. I'm asking you to give me the case and let the petition proceed and accept that what you did will be part of the record, because it will be part of the record regardless. The only question is whether you're the man who cooperated or the man who ran. Brone stood in the street with the document case in his hand and breathed. Lucien watched him. He watched the specific internal process of a 63-year-old man standing at the intersection of everything he had managed and everything he owed in a dark street at midnight, making the calculation that would define the rest of his life. Not a villain's calculation. He had stopped thinking of Brone in those terms somewhere in the process of building the case, because the documentation had made clear that Brone was the kind of man who had done a terrible thing, not from cruelty, but from the specific human failure of deciding that his own interests were worth one particular compromise, and then discovering that the compromise had no endpoint. That kind of man was not evil. He was ordinary, in the specific way that ordinary could do extraordinary damage. Brone set the document case on the ground. He stepped back from it. He turned and walked back to his carriage without another word. Lucien picked up the case. He opened it. The letter was there. The original, in his future father-in-law's precise, slightly forward-leaning script, exactly as the copy had reproduced it. He held it for a moment in the street's ambient light. This piece of paper that had been a weapon for 5 years and was now, in his hands, something else entirely. He put it inside his coat. He sent the signal to Marcus's men to stand down. I was back in his carriage and moving through the city's dark streets when his secretary materialized at the window, having clearly been following at a distance in case of complications, and held out a folded note with the expression of a man who knew the night had not yet finished. Lucien took it. He read it. He read it a second time. The note was from his contact inside the palace. 3 sentences. The kind of 3 sentences that do not require elaboration because the weight of their content is self-evident. Crown Duke Blackthorn has called an emergency session of the Royal Council for tomorrow morning. Agenda: formal inquiry into improper conduct during council petition preparation. Named party: Duke Lucien Ravenscroft. The carriage moved through the dark city. Lucien sat with the letter in his coat and the note in his hand, and understood that the operation that had just succeeded, the retrieval, the confrontation, the removal of the Arden family's most durable weapon, had taken place approximately 8 hours too late to prevent Adrian Blackthorn from doing the one thing Lucien had not accounted for. Not the Arden family moving first. Adrian. Not using the letter, not using Brone, not using the institutional machinery of the family that had been blackmailing him for 2 years. Using the council itself. Using the procedural authority of his position to call an inquiry that would, if it proceeded, freeze the petition's filing pending investigation and give the Arden Network exactly the 18 days they needed to reclassify every piece of evidence in the case under legal challenge. Adrian Blackthorn, who Seraphina had assessed as a man being managed by his circumstances, had made a choice. Not the choice of a coerced man doing the minimum required of him. The choice of a man who had looked at the board and decided that his survival required Lucien's destruction, and who had access to instruments that operated faster than any private action could counter. The carriage stopped outside Ravenscroft House. Lucien did not go inside. He sat in the still carriage in the dark street outside his own house, and held the original letter in one hand and the council notice in the other, and understood what the next 12 hours required. The inquiry was scheduled for 9 in the morning. The council session was a formal mechanism. It required quorum. It required the filing of a response. It required the named party to present either a defense or an absence that would be interpreted as admission. If Lucien appeared, he appeared as a man defending himself against Adrian's framing. If he didn't appear, the inquiry proceeded without him. Either way, the petition was frozen. Unless. He looked at the letter. There was one action available that the council inquiry could not survive. One move on the board that would reframe everything: the inquiry, the petition, the engagement, the 5-year history of the Arden family's operation, in a single session that could not be adjourned or procedurally delayed. It required the letter. It required the copy. It required Brone's cooperation, which was now, as of 40 minutes ago, a different variable than it had been this morning. And it required one other thing, a thing that was not his to unilaterally decide, that belonged to the woman who had read her father's handwriting in his study and had set the folder down and walked out with both hands free. It required Seraphina, not as a partner in the background, not as the fiancé whose name and family records provided institutional weight to a legal filing, as the primary actor, the woman who stood in front of the council and made the filing herself, in her own name, with her father's letter in her hand, with 5 years of careful intelligence and one night of losing everything she'd thought she knew, forming the specific, irreducible foundation of a woman who had stopped waiting to be protected and had decided to be the thing that did the protecting. It would cost her more than anything the partnership had yet required. It would put her name, her father's name, and her family's specific failures in front of the Royal Council before the Arden Network could control the framing. It would make her the story in a way that left no version of herself available to retreat to. It was also the only move that won. He told his driver to take him to the Vale townhouse. The city moved past the carriage windows, the late-night streets, the working-class districts still showing lights, the steady, indifferent momentum of a city that did not calibrate its operations to the urgency of the people moving through it. Lucien sat with the letter and the council notice and thought about what he was about to ask. He thought about a woman on a garden bench who had looked at something that was going to hurt her and looked anyway. He thought about a woman who had sat across from him in a working study and said yes to an arrangement that offered her function without promising her comfort, because she had lived long enough with comfort that concealed nothing real to understand the difference. He thought about what she had said when she took the folder. "I am done being the version of me that people are comfortable with." He did not think it would be a difficult conversation. He thought it would be the hardest thing he had ever asked anyone. The carriage stopped outside the Vale townhouse. The windows were dark. It was nearly 2 in the morning. He got out. He looked up at the dark windows of the house where a woman was either sleeping or lying awake in the dark, running the same numbers he had been running for the last 40 minutes. He raised his hand to knock. The door opened before he touched it. Seraphina was standing in the doorway in a gray house robe with her hair down and a candle in her hand, and the expression of a woman who had been awake and had heard the carriage and had already, in the time it took him to walk from the carriage to the door, assembled herself for whatever came next. She looked at his face. She looked at the letter in his hand. She looked at the council notice. She read the council notice in approximately 4 seconds. She looked up at him. "Tell me what we need to do," she said. And from somewhere down the street, close, too close, the specific sound of horses moving at controlled urgency rather than the casual pace of a late-night traveler, came the sound of a second carriage. Not his, moving fast, toward them. The carriage came fast and stopped hard. Not the controlled deceleration of a scheduled arrival, but the abrupt halt of a vehicle pushed to its limit and reined in at the last possible moment. Horses breathing loud in the cold street, the driver's posture carrying the specific tension of a man who had been ordered to move quickly and had done it without asking why. Adrian Blackthorn stepped out alone. No outriders, no attendants. The Crown Duke of the realm standing in a residential street at 2 in the morning in a coat he had clearly thrown on over informal clothes, his hair carrying the evidence of a night that had not involved sleep, his face stripped of every layer of court architecture down to something that Seraphina had never seen there before, and that she recognized, with the clarity of a woman who had spent the last 12 hours burning through every remaining version of her own composure, as genuine desperation. He looked at her in the doorway. He looked at Lucien beside her. He looked at the letter in Lucien's hand and the council notice in Seraphina's, and he did the rapid, experienced calculation of a man reading a room and finding that the room had moved considerably past the point where his preferred approach was available. "I filed the inquiry before I knew about Brone," he said. No preamble. His voice had the raw quality of a man who had stopped managing his presentation somewhere in the carriage ride over. "I filed it because Harrow told me Ravenscroft was moving on the archive tonight, and I thought—" He stopped. The breath he drew was not steady. "I thought if I moved first I could control the framing before the Arden family did. I didn't know Ravenscroft already had the copy. I didn't know you'd read the letter." Seraphina looked at him standing in the street and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not contempt, not the banked anger she had been carrying since the masquerade, but the specific, exhausted sorrow of recognizing that a man she had believed in for 5 years had been, in the end, exactly what the evidence had always suggested, and she had chosen not to see. Not a villain, not a coward, just a man who had, at every critical junction, chosen the action that preserved his position rather than the action that preserved his integrity, and had done it so consistently and for so long that the choosing had become indistinguishable from his character. "You filed a council inquiry against the man I'm engaged to marry," she said, "to protect yourself from the consequences of your own choices. To protect the crown from a petition that—" "Adrian," her voice was very quiet. The specific quiet that is not the absence of force, but its concentration. "Stop." He stopped. "I have my father's letter," she said. "Lucien has the original. We have Brone. We have 14 months of documentation that will survive any council inquiry you file. Because the inquiry itself will become Exhibit 1 in the case against the network that has been managing you for 2 years. She held his gaze without accommodation. "The inquiry does not help you. It accelerates your exposure, and you know that, which is why you're here at 2 in the morning instead of waiting for 9 o'clock. The street was very quiet around them. The cold night air moved between the three of them, and Seraphina thought that this was what the end of things looked like. Not dramatic, not operatic, but this. A street, a candle. 3 people who had been circling the same center for years, finally standing still enough to see it clearly. "Withdraw the inquiry," Lucien said. His voice was even, not aggressive. The voice of a man making a statement of available options rather than a threat. "Tonight, send the withdrawal to the council secretary before the session convenes. The petition proceeds on its original schedule. The Arden Network's exposure happens through legal process, not political maneuvering, and you have the opportunity to be the Crown Duke who cooperated with its dismantling rather than the Crown Duke who had to be dismantled along with it." Adrian looked at him. There was a long moment in which Seraphina watched Adrian Blackthorn make the specific internal journey of a man who has arrived at a confrontation expecting to find leverage and has found instead the complete absence of it. Not because his opponents have been cruel or overwhelming, but because the truth has been assembled into a shape that leverage cannot alter. She watched his face do the work of that journey. It was not pleasant to watch. She did not look away. "And Celeste," he said finally. His voice had changed again. Lower, carrying something that was neither political nor strategic, but simply the weight of a man asking about a woman he had genuinely cared for in the ruins of everything that caring had cost. What happens to Celeste? Lady Celeste Arden, Seraphina said carefully, is not the target of the petition. Her family's network is. What she knew and when she knew it will be part of the record, but the determination of her culpability is the council's, not mine. She paused. I am not interested in destroying Celeste Arden. I am interested in dismantling the system her family built. Those are not the same objective. He looked at her for a long moment. You've changed, he said. It was the second time he had said it, and it landed differently this time. Not with the edge of a man recalibrating a variable, but with the flat, final quality of a man acknowledging something he could not alter. I told you before, she said. You're seeing me clearly for the first time. That's different. Adrian looked at the letter in Lucien's hand. He looked at the council notice in Seraphina's. He looked at his own carriage, at the horses still breathing in the cold, at the specific geometry of a situation that had no exit, that preserved what he had been trying to preserve. He looked at Seraphina one more time. It was the look of a man saying goodbye to something he had never properly held, which is its own specific category of loss. The loss not of what you had, but of what you had been telling yourself was still available. The loss of the future tense. She saw it, and she let herself feel the weight of it, not with grief exactly, but with the particular human acknowledgement that even the things you are right to release had weight while you were carrying them. I'll send the withdrawal tonight, he said. He got back into the carriage. It pulled away down the quiet street, and the sound of it receded, and then it was gone, and the night was simply the night again, cold and dark, and indifferent in the way of things that have no investment in what the people moving through them decide. Seraphina stood in the doorway for a moment after the sound disappeared, so became aware, in the specific way of a body that has been running on urgency and has felt the urgency lift, that she was very tired. Not the tired of weakness, but the tired of conclusion. The bone-deep exhaustion of a sustained effort that has just reached its terminal point. Her hands, when she looked at them, were steady. She noted this with something close to satisfaction. Lucien was looking at her. She looked back. Come inside, she said. They sat in the front parlor, the room of transaction, the neutral ground, with the candle between them and the letter on the table and the council notice beside it, and for a long time neither of them said anything. Seraphina found that she did not want to speak immediately. She wanted to sit in the specific silence of the aftermath, in the room where things had been decided, and let the decision occupy its full space before language reduced it. She thought about her father, not the version she had been carrying, the innocent man destroyed by pure malice, the template of righteous suffering around which she had built her entire model of what had been done to her family. She thought about the real version, the man who had made decisions under pressure that he had not been strong enough to make transparently, who had trusted the wrong person with the wrong information, who had created, out of ordinary human failure and ordinary human fear, the specific vulnerability that his enemies had been waiting to exploit. She thought about how much she loved him. She thought about how that love was unchanged. She thought about what it meant to love someone clearly, to hold both the failure and the man, the mistake and the intention, the 30 years of careful building and the one season of choices that had made the building vulnerable. To understand that being someone's child meant inheriting their full humanity, not the curated version. That grief without the full picture was not grief but myth, and that myths, however comforting, could not survive contact with people who had been paid to weaponize them. She thought about what it meant to forgive a dead man, not the performance of forgiveness, not the social mechanism that says I release this so that I appear to be above it. The actual thing, the interior act of a woman sitting in a candlelit room, deciding that her father's imperfection did not diminish his love, and that the people who had used his mistakes as a weapon were responsible for what they had done with them, not for the mistakes themselves, and that she could hold all of that simultaneously without requiring it to be simpler than it was. She thought this was possibly the hardest thing she had done all week. She thought she would need to do it more than once before it settled. He made a mistake, she said. Her voice was very quiet. My father. Yes, Lucien said. And he trusted the wrong man with it. Yes, and that's not the story I've been living. She looked at the letter on the table. Her father's handwriting, visible from where she sat, the precise forward-leaning script that had written her birthday letters, and her business education, and the correspondence of a man who had tried to build something real. I've been living a simpler story. I've been the daughter of a man who was purely wronged, which made me someone who was purely wronged, and that made everything, every choice, every patience, every calculation, justified, clean. She breathed. It wasn't clean. No, Lucien said. It wasn't. Does that... She stopped. She started again. Does the real version change what was done to him? What was done to us? No, he said. His mistakes created a vulnerability. The Arden family's choice to weaponize it is their responsibility. Those aren't the same thing, and the law will treat them as distinct. He paused. But you already know that. You're not asking about the law. She looked at him. I'm asking, she said, whether a person can build something solid on a foundation that turned out to be cracked. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man assembling a palatable answer, but the quiet of a man going somewhere real in his own history, the kind of interior travel that left evidence on the face if you knew what to look for. My father, he said, spent the last 8 years of his life trying to undo a decision he made when he was 32 years old. A political decision that cost 3 families their lands, and cost him, eventually, everything he thought the decision had bought him. He looked at the candle. He told me the winter before he died that the worst thing about living with a serious mistake was not the consequences. It was the discovery that the mistake had not made him a different person than he'd been before it. That the man who made it was the same man who had to live with it, and that there was no clean separation between the two. He looked at her. He said the only thing he ever figured out was that you don't build over a cracked foundation. You go down into it. You repair what can be repaired, and you reinforce what can't be removed, and you build on the honest version of it. The honest version holds. Seraphina looked at him for a long time. She thought about this garden. She thought about the stone bench, and the pearl and obsidian mask in her lap, and the sound of his voice telling her the truth before he asked her for anything. She thought about the study, and the folder, and the 300 pages of preparation, and the fact that he had not told her about Brone until she found it herself, and the fact that when she had confronted him about it, he had not constructed a justification. He had told her the decision and the reasoning and the uncertainty about whether the decision was right. She thought about what it meant to be seen by a person who did not require you to be simpler than you were. Lucien, she said. Yes. The petition is going to succeed. Yes. And the Arden network will be dismantled, and the families they damaged will have the record corrected. She looked at him steadily. My father's mistakes will be part of that record. Yes. And you're asking me to stand in front of the council with his letter in my hand and present it myself. I'm asking you to be the one who decides what that means, he said. Not me. The framing of your father's role in this, the context around the letter, that belongs to you. I can build the legal architecture. I can't make the human argument. Only you can make the human argument. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about standing in front of the royal council. She thought about the faces that would be there. The men who had watched her navigate 5 years of careful positioning, who had assessed her as the woman beside the Crown Duke, who had recalibrated when she moved to Lucien's side, who had absorbed every version of her that she had offered them as a social currency. She thought about what it would mean to stand in front of those faces and offer them something that was not a performance, something that was the actual version. Her father's mistake, the Arden family's exploitation of it, 5 years of her own careful survival, and the specific earned clarity of a woman who had gone down into the cracked foundation and repaired it with the honest materials available. She thought it would be the most frightening thing she had ever done. She thought it would also, for the first time in 5 years, be entirely hers. I'll be ready, she said. Lucien looked at her with those dark, still eyes, and she saw in them the thing she had been learning to read. Not the court's coldness, not the political predator's calculation, but the specific quality of a man who had spent a very long time building walls of function around something that was, underneath the function, entirely intact. He reached across the table and picked up her father's letter. He held it for a moment, this document that had been a weapon and would become, in her hands, something different. Then he set it in front of her. It's yours, he said. She picked it up. She held it, the paper, slightly worn at the edges from 5 years in Brone's keeping, the ink still clear, her father's handwriting still the same precise forward lean that she had known since childhood. She held it and felt the weight of it, which was not the weight of evidence or legal instrument or political leverage, but simply the weight of a human being's moment of weakness, preserved in ink, surviving him. She folded it carefully. She put it in the pocket of her house robe. "Go home," she told Lucien. "Sleep if you can. We have 8 hours before the session." He stood. He looked at her. A look that held no urgency, no strategy, nothing that required a response or a performance. Just the look of a man who was, in this specific moment, not managing anything at all. "Seraphina," he said. "Yes. What I told you in the garden, about falling in love with you before the night you accepted my proposal." He said it with the same quality he had said everything from the beginning, without ornamentation, without the vocabulary of courtship, without the elaborate presentation of a feeling designed for an audience. Plainly, at the cost of saying it plainly. "I want you to know that nothing that's happened in the last 3 days has altered that. It's not a strategic statement. I'm not telling you because the situation requires it." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about love, not the performance of it, not the vocabulary of it, not the version that required someone to be softened or curated or arranged for. She thought about what it actually felt like to be seen, specifically and without concession, by a person who had no investment in what they found and found it worth the investment anyway. "Lucien," she said. "Yes. When this is over," she said, "when the petition has been filed and the council has done what it's going to do, and the Arden network is a legal matter rather than a living threat, I want a week where none of it exists. Where we are not Duke and Duchess to be, not political allies, not the story the court is telling about us." She looked at him steadily. "I want to know who you are when there's nothing to win." Something happened in his face that she had seen once before. In the garden, on the bench, when she had told him she would consider the proposal. The barely there shift that required knowing what to look for. She was becoming, she thought, very good at knowing what to look for. "That," he said, "is the only thing you've asked for that I can give you without any reservation at all." He left. She sat alone in the front parlor with the candle burning down, and the letter in her pocket, and the specific silence of a house in the deepest part of the night, and she stayed there for a long time. She thought about everything that had been dismantled in the last 4 days. Not only the external structures, not only the Arden network, and Brone's betrayal, and Adrian's choices, and the 5 years of careful positioning that had turned out to be positioning toward the wrong thing. She thought about the interior dismantling, the version of herself that had required the clean story, the version that had needed her father to be purely wronged, and herself to be purely patient, and the world to be organized around a narrative that rewarded the kind of careful, composed survival she had been performing. That version had not survived the week. She was not grieving it. She was sitting in the candlelight with her father's letter in her pocket and the honest foundation beneath her, and thinking about what it meant to build something real, not something elegant, not something that performed well from the outside, but something that could hold the full weight of 2 people who had each been damaged in their specific ways and had decided, against the considerable evidence that damage accumulates, that building was worth the risk. She thought it was worth the risk. She thought for the first time in 5 years that she was the right person to be making that assessment. The council session was at 9. At 8:45, Lady Seraphina Vale walked into the royal council chamber in the gray wool she wore when she intended to be taken seriously, with her father's letter in her hand, with Lucien Ravenscroft at her side, and with the particular quality of presence that belongs to people who have stopped asking permission to occupy their full space. The council members watched her enter with the collective attention of men who had spent their careers reading rooms and were reading this one carefully. She sat down. She set the letter on the table in front of her. She looked at the council, at the 4 men whose names were in Lucien's documentation, at the others who were not compromised but who had been comfortable in the compromised structure, at the procedural architecture of the room that had been used to dismantle her family and had now, by the specific gravity of choice and consequence, become the instrument of that dismantling's reversal. She thought about her father. She thought about a man who had built things and made mistakes and loved his daughter and trusted the wrong person and left her, in the end, with more than he had known. Not the clean legacy. The real one, complicated, cracked, repairable, worth repairing. She thought that was actually what a legacy was. Not what you left perfect, what you left worth continuing. Crown Duke Adrian Blackthorn did not appear at the session. His withdrawal notice had arrived at the council secretary's office at 4:15 in the morning. Seraphina opened the letter. She began to speak. She spoke for 40 minutes. She spoke without notes, and without performance, and without the careful modulation of a woman managing an audience's reaction. She spoke about her father and his mistakes, and the men who had been paid to make those mistakes as ruinous as possible. She spoke about 5 years in a legal campaign and an advisor who had held his employer's trust as a commercial transaction. She spoke about the network that had been operating behind the court's architecture for a decade, and she presented the documentation, and she named the names, and she did not look away from a single face in the room while she did it. When she was done, the chamber was very quiet. Then Lucien spoke. He spoke for 20 minutes. The legal architecture, precise and complete. The 14 months of preparation delivered without theater, in the specific, devastating language of a man who has built something that holds. He presented the financial trail, the correspondence analysis, the Brown documentation, the original letter alongside the copy, the procedural framework for the council's response. When he was done, he looked at Seraphina. She looked back. There was a moment, brief, private, invisible, to the 300 years of institutional weight assembled in that room, in which two people who had both spent a very long time building walls of competence around the things they could not afford to expose acknowledged, in the specific language of a glance held a half-second longer than function required, that something had survived the week that neither of them had been expecting to find on the other side of it. The council voted at 11:15. The Arden Network's legal challenge to the Northern Trade Agreements was suspended pending full inquiry. The 4 compromise council members were placed on procedural review. Aldrich Brown's cooperation was formally noted in the record. The petition was accepted. The vote was not close. Afterward, in the corridor outside the council chamber, while attendants moved with the specific urgency of institutions reconfiguring themselves around a new reality, Lucien stood beside her, and they were briefly, entirely alone. She looked at him. "It held," she said. "Yes," he said. "The honest foundation." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the corridor's windows, the city was going about its ordinary business in the late autumn light. The commerce and the arguments and the daily weight of 10,000 lives that did not know or care that 3 floors above them, something that had been broken for years, had just been repaired. She found this, for the first time, not disorienting, but simply true. The world's indifference to specific human events was not cruelty. It was the condition that made human events matter. The fact that nothing external would acknowledge them meant the acknowledgement had to come from the people who lived them. "You said you wanted a week," Lucien said, "when it was over." "I did." "It's over." She looked at him, at the face that was not beautiful in the court's decorative sense, but that she had come to read as precisely as her own, with its sharp angles and its still eyes, and the specific, barely there movements that were his version of what other people expressed in full sentences. She looked at him and thought about the garden and the study and the street at 2 in the morning and the 40 minutes in the council chamber and all the versions of honest that had been required to arrive at this specific corridor in this specific light. She thought that she had spent 5 years being patient for the wrong thing. She thought patience for the right thing felt entirely different. "Then take me somewhere," she said, "where there's nothing to win." He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out of the council building into the late autumn light, into the city that did not stop for them, into the ordinary and extraordinary fact of 2 people who had each survived their own particular wreckage, deciding, with the specific, undecorated courage of people who know exactly what it costs, to build something together on the honest ground. And the city moved around them, indifferent and alive, the way cities always do, carrying forward everything that had happened and everything that had not, the mistakes and the repairs and the letters and the choices, the garden benches and the midnight streets and the council chambers and the candlelit rooms, all of it folding into the ordinary morning as if it had always been there, waiting for 2 people stubborn enough and clear-eyed enough and damaged enough in precisely the right ways to finally see it. This is where their story ends. Not with triumph, not with the clean conclusion of a narrative that was always heading here, but with 2 people walking into a day that belongs to them, having gone down into the cracked foundations, having repaired what could be repaired, having stood in the rooms that required standing in and said the things that required saying, and having discovered, on the other side of all of it, that the honest version holds. It always holds. That is the only thing worth building on, and it is enough.